Whitehead invented a jargon in which familiar words are used in novel ways. His book, Process and Reality, tells us about a kind of entity we never heard of before, an actual occasion. These entities last a very short time and are subatomic in the sense that atoms are, roughly speaking, societies of actual occasions. Yet they can, Whitehead tells us, do a lot of things we might have thought only humans can do. They can envisage concepts and propositions, share feelings, make decisions, and exhibit creativity. Obviously, words like proposition and feeling do not, in Whitehead, mean what they mean in ordinary speech. It helps in dealing with this jargon to remind ourselves that Whitehead is doing what all the great philosophers did. They all created new jargons. They all took words that had familiar uses and gave them new technical uses. By the time Plato had finished with the word eidos, which had meant something like visual appearance, it denoted a kind of invisible thing imitated by changeable entities in the visible world. Aristotle changed the meaning of the word ousia, which had meant something like possessions, and of the word hule, which had meant something like timber. He did so in order to create a new language game, one in which ousia, eidos, and hule, the words we translate as substance, form, and matter, denoted kinds of things that stood in problematic relationships to one another. Plato's and Aristotle's jargons were initially as baffling as Whitehead's. Whitehead claimed that Descartes made what he called, I quote, the greatest philosophical discovery since the age of Plato and Aristotle. He did so, quote, by laying down the principle that those substances which are the subjects enjoying conscious experiences provide the primary data for philosophy, namely themselves in the enjoyment of such experiences. Whitehead's way of putting it suggests that everybody had always known that we had conscious experiences and that Descartes was simply the first to realize their significance for philosophy. But we should remind ourselves that Plato and Aristotle would not have understood what Whitehead was talking about. There is no expression in Greek that can plausibly be translated as conscious experience. In order for that term to become part of our repertoire so that Whitehead could assume that his readers would know how to wield it, a lot of linguistic manipulation had to take place. First, Descartes had to put the novel notion of res cogitans in circulation. Then Locke had to give a new use to the word idea. Locke's notion of an idea as whatever is before a man's mind when he thinks, built on Cartesian foundations, and consolidated Descartes' novel way of describing the human situation. Kant consolidated it further by giving a novel use to the word Vorstellung. Hume and Kant both thought that what initially comes before a person's mind when she thinks are little atoms of consciousness called sense impressions, or not yet synthesized empirical intuitions. Whitehead claimed that this was a misdescription of conscious experience. So did Bergson and James, to whom Whitehead acknowledges indebtedness. They all thought that Hume had been wrong to claim that what's given in experience are unrelated qualia. They argued that relations are themselves directly given. This was thought to be a great breakthrough. Readers of Bergson and Whitehead, who were worried about the compatibility of freedom and determinism, were delighted to be told that materialist mechanism had been based on what Whitehead called a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. But in the middle of the 20th century, philosophers began wondering if a still more startling breakthrough might be possible. In the 1950s, Wittgenstein, Ryle, and Sellers suggested that we simply abandon the notion of conscious experience. They urged that Descartes had not made a great discovery. Instead, he had suckered us into using a vocabulary that had proved much more trouble than it was ever worth. Followers of Wittgenstein, such as Dennett, suggested that the Cartesian theater and the various conscious experiences said to appear on its stage were as fanciful, imaginative constructions as Platonic forms or Aristotelian hylomorphic substances. They were equally dispensable. What Descartes had done to Aristotle should now be done to him. Like others in my generation of philosophers in the United States, I was initially enthusiastic about Whitehead but later deserted him for Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, I came to think, had freed us from questions like what is immediately given in experience and what is truly concrete and what is a mere abstraction. Now we were in a position to consign the question, what is experience really like, to the same wastebasket as the question, what is the intrinsic nature of reality, or the question, are human beings really free or really determined? On a Wittgensteinian view, there is no issue about free will and determinism to resolve, for our use of the vocabulary of individual responsibility need not interfere with our use of a mechanistic vocabulary for predictive purposes. There are no dualisms to be overcome, merely alternative vocabularies to be used in tandem. By treating the vocabulary of natural science as just one among others, useful for some purposes and not for other purposes, we obviate the worry that science might explain away things that we should hang on to. That worry motivated much of Whitehead's thinking. But we Wittgensteinians think there was nothing to worry about. For to describe ourselves in one way does nothing to prevent our describing ourselves in dozens of other ways. Reductionism is a bogeyman. Wittgensteinians, like myself, discard James's radical empiricism and his essay, Does Consciousness Exist?, the parts of James's work that Whitehead most admired, but we keep James's pragmatism. So I approach Whitehead with such questions as, what, if anything, is his jargon good for? What purpose might it serve? In what respects is it an improvement on those I'm currently using? I'm not willing to accept the answer that Isabel Stengers seems to suggest, namely, the jargon discloses what had previously remained undisclosed. Of course it does, but that doesn't tell us whether it's good for anything. Any imaginative new philosophical or scientific jargon does that, just as does any novel literary or artistic production. What Heidegger called Welterschließung happens whenever somebody is sufficiently imaginative and adventuresome. Plato, St. Paul, Dante, Giotto, Galileo, Darwin, Wittgenstein, and Whitehead all disclosed something. They disclosed, if you like, worlds. But we can't live in all those worlds at once. We have to stand back from these achievements and pick and choose among them. We can't make such choices by comparing the newly disclosed world with our conscious experiences. This is because, we Wittgensteinians believe, there's no such thing as knowing what an object or a conscious experience or anything else is like, except by knowing which sentences are true of it and which false. Sentences are framed in vocabularies, and vocabularies are expanded in order to flesh out discourses, so we can only praise or blame one discourse in terms provided by another discourse. This means that we cannot appeal from discourse to non-discourse. As Hegel put it, spirit never confronts anything except itself. For Hegelians, as for Wittgensteinians, there is no such thing as immediate acquaintance with nature unspiritualized, or as Wittgenstein put it, no way to get between a word and its referent. This means that, Pace Whitehead, the primary data of philosophy are not subjects enjoying conscious experiences, but rather the various linguistic descriptions of things that human beings have so far dreamed of. Isabel Stengers is neither an Hegelian nor a Wittgensteinian. She marks the contrast and makes an important point when she writes, quote, Whitehead's singularity is precisely that his world has nothing to do with Hegel's. She answers the question, why did Whitehead use such a human term as soul to characterize actual occasions by saying, philosophy aims at sheer disclosure. For the reasons I've suggested, the notion of sheer disclosure is one that Hegelians and Wittgensteinians distrust. Stengers invokes a passage in Whitehead's book, Modes of Thought, in which he says, quote, philosophy is either self-evident or it is not philosophy. The attempt of any philosophic discourse should be to produce self-evidence. Of course, it is impossible to achieve any such aim, but nonetheless all inference in philosophy is a sign of that imperfection which clings to all human endeavor. The aim of philosophy is sheer disclosure. Immediately after that passage, Whitehead writes, quote, "The great difficulty of philosophy is the failure of language." And he explains this a bit later when he says, quote, "Language halts behind intuition. Our understanding outruns the ordinary usage of words. Philosophy is akin to poetry. Philosophy is the endeavor to find a conventional phraseology for the vivid suggestiveness of the poet. It is the endeavor to reduce Milton's Lycidas to prose, and thereby to produce a verbal symbolism manageable for use in other connections of thought. On an Hegelian or Wittgensteinian view, our understanding couldn't possibly outrun the usage of words. It can outrun the ordinary usage of words by using words differently, creating a new jargon, for instance. We don't think that language halts behind intuition, and we don't think that philosophers' jargon can help our uses of words catch up with our understanding. If we can't say it, we don't understand it. For people like me, the passage I just quoted from Whitehead raises questions like, why not leave poetry alone? Why try to reduce a poem like Lycidas to prose? Why replace vivid suggestiveness with a conventional phraseology? What can philosophy hope to do that poetry cannot? And there's one further point about the passage I've quoted. Why does Whitehead use Lycidas as his example? One would have expected him to cite something by Wordsworth or Shelley, the poets whom he celebrated and contrasted sharply with Milton in Science and the Modern World. The pragmatist question, what is Whitehead's jargon good for, boils down for me to the question, what, if anything, does Whitehead add to Wordsworth? I'm not sure that Process and Reality does do anything for us that was not already done by poems such as Tintern Abbey. But again, why did Whitehead cite Lycidas? I suspect the answer is simply biographical. Lycidas is an elegy for Edward King, who died too young. So did Whitehead's son, who was killed in World War I. It's often been suggested that that death provoked Whitehead's attempt in Part 5 of Process and Reality to describe a new sort of God. This finite deity is not an omnipotent creator, but rather the being whose consequent nature retains traces of the tiniest details of the lives of both Edward King and Eric Whitehead. This God will grant each of us the same sort of objective immortality. He or she is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. The doctrine of the consequent nature of God seems to me the only useful product of Whitehead's attempt to construct a philosophy of organism. But perhaps it is, all by itself, a good enough product to justify the laborious system-building efforts of parts 2 through 4, the parts of Process and Reality that develop the implications of the categorical scheme Whitehead lays out in Part 1. I think it's no accident that Whitehead's so-called process theology is what has kept his books in print. As Stengers rightly remarks, for years it was through the teaching and the books of the philosopher-theologian Charles Hartshorne that Whitehead was transmitted. Stengers, however, thinks that the theological use of Whitehead will remain an American specialty, and that for Europeans like herself, the books of Yvon Leclerc and William Christian are more useful than those of Whitehead and those of Hartshorne and his followers. The former writers, she says, published the first truly philosophical interpretations of his work. It was not, she says, that they disregarded Whitehead's theological preoccupations, but that they focused on what she calls the conceptual coherence of the system as a whole. I agree that commentators like Leclerc and Christian are very good at letting one grasp the coherence of the Whiteheadian system, but I regard coherence as a relatively minor intellectual virtue. Lots of kooky systems are marvelously coherent. Leibniz's monadology, for instance. Its pieces interlock as smoothly and elegantly as those that make up Whitehead's cosmology. But neither system is more faithful to the facts of conscious experience or to the nature of reality than the other. For there is no such thing as fidelity to these facts or to that nature. Discourses cannot be judged on the basis of such fidelity, but only on the basis of their utility for human purposes. Whitehead's and Leibniz's systems are impressive imaginative creations, though perhaps not as impressive as either Paradise Lost or The Prelude. I prefer Whitehead to Leibniz simply because I think that the footnote to Wordsworth that is part 5 of Process and Reality offers us a more useful God than Leibniz's.